You see, the first phase has already begun, and this was the foreign minister level interaction. And that means there is some indication, both from Iran as well as United States, and that is why Pakistan brokered this effort. And Pakistan, being a very reliable and honest broker, has attained this stature because of its neutrality and faith in Iranians that Pakistan would be a venue which is not, according to their own thinking, tainted with the presence of any aggressive base, which even a country like Oman, which was earlier facilitating a peace process, it also was attacked because of its, uh, hosting of U.S. Troops there. So the beginning has been made. The one-day session, I believe it was one day, it was wound up because of the logistics, but I think some groundwork has been done. Some initial understandings have been given. The communications would be done, and the Iranians would also be taken into confidence. And there are certain overtures which are from Iran, which indicate interest of Iran into this process. The only thing is at what time and what on what conditions would Iran agree to come on the negotiating table through its top tier. You see, that's a very mercurial nature of the style of President Trump, but I believe uh, it's all part of a strategy to offer some incentives as well as keep some disincentives also alive so as to exert the kind of pressure United States wishes to exert. At this point of time, we must understand that it is an asymmetric conflict, and it is an asymmetry in terms of political strategic goals, in terms of the tactics and strategy, and in terms of the end game as well, because there's one protagonist in the conflict equation, that is Iran, which is looking at this conflict from the lens of an asymmetric war, because they've got the tools, they've got the geography, they've got the time, and they've got the national resolve. Whereas United States, which was fighting for, it was a war of choice for Americans, whereas it's a war of existence for Iran. And American Achilles heel is in the ground troops, because they had configured their armed forces over a period of time to fight a high intensity information age enabled war, which is characterized by network centricity, AI enabling networks, and precision weaponry focused logistics. That's a different kind of warfare they had envisaged. But in this case, the Iranians, they are up against Americans, and they are offering dogged resistance on ground through underground caverns full of their ballistic missile projectiles, and also a national will and resolve to fight an infantry heavy asymmetric guerrilla warfare. And whenever there is a conflict in which two protagonists clash, one is using direct strategy like Americans, and another is using asymmetric tactics. We know, the scholars tell us, that the prognosis is heavily laden in favor of the asymmetric warrior. The Americans had, lain off in order to make their army lean, mobile, agile. They had cut down on infantry components. There were 12 BCTs, brigade combat teams, that were reduced. So at this point of time, though they are mustering the marine component from Okinawa and some 82nd Airborne, another brigade size strength, but all told, nothing is clear as to what those Marines are going to do, whether they are going to come for holding Khark, whether they are going to go for a beachhead, whether they are going for a limited offensive. Because if there is no strategy, the tactics would go a begging. Therein lies the dilemma for Americans, because with this little component of infantry. They cannot hold ground, and even if they hold ground, they'll be presenting a target-rich environment. So within this asymmetry, the politics is also changing. That with each gradual rung by rung climbing of the military, acts, the politics is also changing, and both actors in conflict equation, including Israelis, would get trapped into an escalation trap. And the things are difficult at this point of time for Americans, because they've got all the tools, they've got the weaponry, they've got the missiles, they've got the will to come and exert the maximum pressure, but they are up against an adversary which is not playing the same game that they're playing. And then there is energy politics, the Gulf nations, which are in great stress. And mind you, there's a complete blanket as of now. We do not know what are the actual ground, which is the actual ground impact of the attacks on Gulf nations. UAE and Bahrain have been badly battered. There was an attack on aluminium factory, which is giving a very valuable revenue not only to UAE, but it is feeding the European market as well. So those losses, which are economical, which are destroying the energy infrastructure and other civilian infrastructure, that is not being reported well. But the real situation is that America is under great stress because of this oil supply blockade, and there are no clear answers as to how those two shipping lanes essentially could be opened, whether through escorts or through some other means, because there are plenty of asymmetric options with Iranians, very less options with Americans. Of course, it's a leverage and a pressure tactics being used by United States to create conditions and force Iranians to come to negotiating table from a position of, if not weakness, from a position of reasonableness. At least what the Americans think the reasonableness is. But the problem is that with this little component of marine, what would Americans achieve? What their precision weaponry and the carrier-based platforms could not achieve. Till the time they are not capable of landing proper troops to terrain ratio, and unless they achieve that troops to terrain ratio for a country which is 5 times the size of Iraq, I think they cannot achieve any worthwhile objectives through a ground maneuver. And if there is no ground maneuver, there's not going to be a regime change, because with this precision weaponry and long range vectors that the Americans are using, they might cause more pain points, and they can trigger more pain points. And the threshold of Iranians is being tested by them. But so far, the Iranians are well dug in, and they have shown good equipoise and ability to resist. And they also have their retaliatory ballistic missile strike capability still intact, because apparently they have dispersed their assets, and they are capable of manufacturing even the drones as they are being bombed. So there is a very difficult situation for America and its allies, and therein lies the dilemma for those who are doing these mediatory efforts. Any mediator which is facilitating a contact between United States and Iran has to factor in this thing, and Pakistan is alive to this challenge, because it is the call of Iranians now. They think that by prolonging the history of asymmetric warfare tells us that when a weaker actor prolongs the war, it redounds to its advantage. So perhaps they are doing these calculations, and they think that by prolonging the war, they can maximize their options. And once they come onto the negotiating table, they come from a position of relative strength so as to clinch a deal that serves their purposes. I think Riaz is very circumspect. They haven't encouraged Israelis or Americans to attack or to continue bombing Iran, despite the Iranian attacks against the uh, Prince Sultan base, they have shown great equanimity, and so far they haven't reacted by way of retaliation. And I believe Iranians also are factoring in that thing because they know that UAE and Bahrain, they are members of Abraham Accords, but not Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia had showed overtures towards Iran, peace overtures, even before this conflict. And that is why I believe Iranians are holding their hands as well. And Saudis would be very careful as to initiate a retaliatory strike or not. And so far, they have shown that restraint. And I think that restraint, if it holds, it would be, quite helpful because if they start retaliating, then other Gulf countries would also follow suit, and the war would expand horizontally more and compared to what it is now. That's a very interesting question as to what implications on Pakistan are foreseen as a consequence of uh, our defense agreement with Saudi Arabia. That Pakistan is, I think, bound by the terms of the agreement to provide defense support to Saudi Arabia. But I think Pakistan's role was envisaged in a specific threat environment in which the threat from Houthis was envisaged from the Yemen side, and then a threat from the Israeli side in case of any eventuality against the Saudi territorial integrity. Iranian attack on Saudi mainland. I think that is something that is kind of a black swan, and still, as a consequence of Pakistan's active diplomacy, Iranians have held their hands. And if this further succeeds, I believe that situation will not come once Pakistan would have to take up cudgels on behalf of Iran, on behalf of Saudi Arabia against Iran, because I think diplomacy is acting as a shield, and that situation perhaps Pakistan is trying to avoid. The proxy warfare itself is problematic because it not only expands the scope of this conflict, but it also hands Netanyahu government uh, carte blanche to go and resort to all kinds of aggressive tactics against Lebanon and maybe against others who operate. The Houthis are also now opening up. So I think that would not be very helpful to the overall peace efforts. And Pakistan should, I think, convey to the Iranians, and I believe it is being done, that though the Lebanese are defending themselves, the Hezbollah is quite active. It has emerged again as a threat to Israel. So, the one school of thought is that Netanyahu wanted to continue this war because it is not in Netanyahu's interest to stop this war, because the moment it stops, goes to elections, and it would be hoist with its own pattern because of his low, ratings. And then not only he would lose elections, but he would go to jail because of his problems with judiciary. So that is why it is in the interest of Netanyahu to expand the war, and it has expanded that war as an insurance uh, in Lebanon that if America goes for a peace and a ceasefire takes effect, there is something to keep him busy. So I think from that angle also the Hezbollah has to be advised properly to not to escalate this conflict and not to hand in an excuse to Israel to continue hostilities. I think that would be part of a package deal. No piecemeal security guarantees would work, and it would be part of a composite negotiating deal, because Iranians already have laid out their requirements. that they want a lasting peace. They want a peace where their future uh, attacks on Iranian soil are avoided. They also wish to extract the concessions that the sanctions regime, which is emasculating them economically, that should be, now lifted. And then they are talking of some war reparations, etc. They are talking of some degree of permanent control over Strait of Hormuz. But I think those are maximalist demands, and they would resile from those maximalist positions once they come onto the negotiating table, because knowing Iranians and their pragmatist nature and proclivity, I am sure once they come onto the negotiating table, the best bet for them would be lifting of economic sanctions and some strong guarantees with international guarantor that in future they will not be subjected to an attack. Yes, I can surmise and make an informed guess, and I believe that Iranian position would not be very dissimilar to what their position was in Vienna and Geneva talks, because they were already ready to, you know, scale down their uranium enrichment to the level of JCPOA, and they were already ready to make some concessions on their ballistic missiles program, and they definitely had indicated that they would like to be part of a international system again if the sanctions are lifted, and they had certain demands about the Israeli behavior as well vis-a-vis Hamas, Palestinian territories, and I think those concerns could also be assuaged during the talks, and it's all doable. So Iranians, to me, were not very unreasonable, and at the moment their demands are a bit maximalist, because as a consequence of the decapitating strikes and the losses they have incurred, the hardening of their positions is expected. And then they are also waiting that how this asymmetric warfare pans out, because the more it is prolonged, the more options they have. I think it's very significant because China is a very close ally and a regional country, which is not only concerned with whatever is happening in Iran, but also impacted greatly because of the blockade of Hormuz. So, if Pakistan can play a part in ensuring a quick resolution, and Pakistan is capable of convincing Iranians to come to the negotiating table as early as possible, I think it would redound to the advantage of China. And then Pakistan also was interacting with China on our Operation Ghazbul and a possible mediation with the Afghan Taliban regime. So China's role is very, very important, and Pakistan and China needs to have a convergence of views on how the mediatory efforts go and quick de-escalation is effected in Iran. I think Iran would look more towards a P5 guarantees, and yes, being a P5 country, China can play its part, and I believe Iranians repose trust in China because of their interactive nature of their economy. And I believe if an international guarantor is asked by Iranians, the United States should also have no problems, because China is a P5 country, and it's just a measure of what negotiations take place and what concessions are made by Americans. Only the guarantee, I think, China can step in at that stage once the guarantees are being discussed. I think Gulat would be, I think, somebody like Israel, which disrupts, and already they have done, they have acted as spoilers, because it is not in the interest of United States to prosecute this war any longer. They have attained their objectives in support of Israel, and the uranium enrichment scaling down objective. I think Americans know that they have gone that far, but Israel wants prolonging of that conflict, and its aim originally was the regime change, which, if it is not achieved, they would, I believe, there's a risk of their acting as a spoiler. I think oil disruption is already upon us, and the proxy conflict is also on. It's all a part of this whole conflict mosaic going on. I believe the resolution of this conflict is the best case scenario. That Israelis should also see the folly of their ways, and they should scale down their initial purported objectives in the interest of peace in the region. United States has to play a very important role because they have to ensure that Israel plays ball with this peace process, and also they offer certain incentives to Iranians which they accept. And Iranians also have to consider that what is that pain threshold that they and their population, that the regime and the population would not cross, and at what point is that continued resistance proving counterproductive, and what is the value of ceasefire and again getting integrated with the global economy. I think it's the call of Iranians and of all the protagonists in this conflict equation. I believe whenever the denouement of this conflict drama takes place, the conflict actor that's going to play as a prima donna is going to be the Iranian. So it's going to be the Iranian call at the end. Before Afghanistan, there was a Vietnam. Remember, there was Somalia also. So I think they'll meet the same fate, unfortunately. My prognosis is grim for them because troops to terrain ratio does not favor Americans, and the geography doesn't favor Americans. The Iranian resolve doesn't favor Americans. It would be a very tough call. It would be a long, drawn out battle in an election year, and Americans would not like to get into this imbroglio any more than any other global power would like to land itself into a very, very unfavorable situation because in this guerrilla tactics, people's war, and asymmetric conflicts, they redound to the advantage of the weaker protagonist in a conflict equation, and which is Iranians, and they've got geography, they've got resolve, they've got the will. Because whenever an asymmetric conflict pans out, it's not the asymmetry of resources, but the asymmetry of will that makes the most difference. It made the difference in Afghanistan, it made the difference in Somalia, it made the difference in Vietnam, and it's not going to be any longer in Iran, any different in Iran.